We always think if there's a problem, the problem must be us. And unfortunately, perfection does not allow other factors into the conversation. So it always making all problems personal. And that's tough. That's tough to live that way. Hey friends, it's Mike Foster. Welcome to the Primal Question podcast. Our goal here is just to talk about things that are going to hopefully shed light on what's inside of you. And I'm not talking about like organs and intestines and heart. What I'm talking about is the things that are inside of you in terms of beliefs and just things from our past and emotions and feelings and particularly understanding a core need that drives our life called the primal question. And I truly believe that the more we turn up the lights and blow away the fog on these issues in our lives, the more powerful we get, the more healthy we get, the more we're living in freedom in terms of our relationships and at work, and really just occupying like a very different space in the world when we understand ourselves and what makes us tick. I think sometimes in our lives, it's almost like playing soccer or a game like baseball, and we don't actually understand the rules. We're out there kind of running around on the field and I don't know, kicking a ball or running around bases, but we don't really understand how the game works or what the rules are or how to win, what losing looks like. And I think that happens a lot in our lives where we just unfortunately don't understand the rules of you, the rules of your emotions and your needs, and how that plays a role in whether you're winning or not in your life. So that's what we talk about here. And that's what I want to cover today. And I want to talk about a very specific part that I want to shine some light on that I believe probably all of us struggle with in some level. And the topic I want to talk today about is perfectionism, and really just entitling this podcast, The Problem with Perfectionism, because there's lots of problems with it. And one of the things that happened in my research for the book, The 7 Primal Questions, is perfectionism showed up a lot in people's scrambles. Again, the ways that the things and the coping mechanisms that we use to force the answer back to a yes to our primal question when we get a no or a maybe. And so seeing perfectionism in our lives, see how it plays out, some things that we can do about that, really understanding how it really undermines our lives and really the things that we are going for in terms of health, emotional health and freedom, and just I think just it's such a weight on our lives and such a chain where we just feel chained up and controlled by it. And so my hope is that we can talk about it a little bit, understand why it's there, understand what to do about it, and give you some practical pointers on today's episode. By the way, if you want to learn more about your primal question, I encourage you to pick up a copy of the book at Amazon.com. It will go into the different profiles of the 7 different questions. It will help you understand your primal question. And by the way, if you're a Q6, the primal question of, am I good enough? This episode is going to help you a lot, because Q6s often are the ones who struggle the most with perfectionism. So let's dive in and let's get to it. So part of this concept of living our best lives means that we have to develop a tolerance for imperfections, for flaws, for our own mistakes. The more tolerance or resilience that we can build around that, that's going to help us create emotional health and strength. But I think so often we are applying this filter of perfectionism to all these different areas of our lives. We feel like we have to be the perfect parent, we have to be the perfect employee, we have to be the perfect friend, we have to be the perfect spouse. all kinds of standards and really unrealistic standards that we put on ourselves that creates a lot of resistance and makes life kind of grind and doesn't make it a lot of fun. I see this happen a lot, this application of perfectionism. I see this happen a lot in our relationships. I think a lot of people struggle with their relationships, and especially the romantic relationships, because they put so many unrealistic standards on the relationship. I heard it described this way, where we often have these super high standards and ideas of what our romantic partner should be or look like, and he has to be 6 foot, he has to make over $100,000, she has to be blonde, blue eye, I don't know, all kinds of standards, right? And what happens is, and they got to be like the perfect listener, and they have to understand my needs and be attentive to those needs, and they got to have a good work ethic and all these sort of values. And I actually knew, and this was actually fairly common when I was growing up, I had a lot of people who would make these very long lists of what a potential partner could look like for them. And sometimes I look at these lists and I go, are you serious? Like, where is that person? Because you're going to have a hard time finding that person. But often, we get into these romantic relationships, and we have these really high standards of perfection, or at least close to perfection. And it's like we're climbing this mountain, right? This Mount Everest mountain of standards. And what happens often when we bring sort of this perfectionism to our romantic relationships is we start climbing that mountain of standards. And unfortunately, the relationship runs out of oxygen. It just actually can't sustain sort of a flawless execution or a perfect listener, or the idea that your spouse or your girlfriend or boyfriend will always make the right decisions, okay? And so we can really see, like, that's going to put you at a huge disadvantage if you bring perfectionism to your romantic relationships. So you might be asking, like, why do we get addicted to perfectionism? Why do we hold these high standards? How did that get into the system, right? So again, in the research for the book, the 7 Primal Questions, I found that a lot of things that we do today are really responses to our early childhood experiences. And so this is very true of perfectionism, because perfectionism is often a response to early childhood trauma. It is often a way that it's a coping mechanism that we use to discharge pain. Sometimes perfectionism shows up because you are a child who experienced divorce in your family. And the divorce can obviously set up a lot of different ripple effects in how children see the world and see the relationships and safety and love. But one of the things that often happens in a divorce is a child will take on this mantle or responsibility to be the perfect kid, because at some level they have felt like the divorce was their fault, that mom and dad would have stayed together if I was a better kid. And so this concept, or really this kid logic, or this scramble of perfectionism that we often enter into, is because it's a response to our parents being divorced or getting divorced. And we think, oh my gosh, if I can just be really good and nothing wrong with me and no flaws, and I can make no mistakes, that will make me good. And that might, again, this is kid logic, and this will help my mom and dad get back together. Oftentimes, perfectionism is a response to a lot of criticism in our childhood. Our parents putting unrealistic expectations on us. And again, it may be subtle, and it may not have been direct, but you felt as a child that you were criticized a lot. And mom and dad had a lot of opinions about you and what you did. And there's sort of maybe this nitpicking that happened. And so what happens in as a child is we think, okay, well, I'll just be perfect. So I'm not criticized. Maybe you grew up and you were the middle child and you were surrounded by a lot of awesome siblings. And so your strategy or your kid logic was, okay, if I can be perfect, maybe I can get mom and dad's attention. Then maybe I could compete in this competition between my siblings. Oftentimes, perfectionism will show up in somebody who experienced, you grew up with an alcoholic or abusive parent. And this is really a child's response where they prepare for every contingency. They have to make sure everything's right, because if everything isn't right and in order and perfect and flawless, then they risk upsetting the abusive parent or drawing attention from their alcoholic father, who tends to be violent and focus all their energy on, the mistakes that the kid might be making. So you can see how, like, how does perfectionism get inside of us? Why do we go to those coping mechanisms so often? Because it's very much has to do and is very much tied to those early childhood imprints, just like our primal question is. And we're using the kid logic or our kid-based solutions to try to solve the problems. Unfortunately, perfectionism doesn't solve everything. And that really brings me to my first kind of big idea here, is that perfectionism, unfortunately, makes everything less perfect. Here's what comes out of perfectionism. You may be able to relate to some of these things. Chronic stress comes from perfectionism and trying to be perfect. Eating disorders, depression. There's generally a persistent dissatisfaction with life. One of the things that I discovered in my own story in my own life is that I did struggle for a long time with perfectionism, and I still, it still wants to pop into my life every once in a while, and I do my best to hold it at bay and really try to operate in a more healthy way with my perfectionistic tendencies. But I remember early on as a dad, one of probably my biggest regrets as a parent was, hey friend, you and I have a hidden force driving our lives. It drives our choices, our behaviors, our triggers, our relationships, and even our strengths and our gifts. And most of us have no idea what it is or how to control it. And this hidden force is an unmet emotional need. There are 7 of them, and I call them the 7 primal questions. And when you don't know your primal question, it can wreak havoc on your life because people will do whatever it takes to meet this need. And we can even try to meet that need in some pretty unhealthy ways. But when you identify your core emotional need, a lot of things begin to make sense. And you'll have the clarity to meet emotional needs for yourself and others in much healthier ways that have far-reaching effects on your life and your relationships. Take 5 minutes to discover your primal question today at primalquestion.com. Applying sort of this perfectionistic standard that I had for my own life onto my kids, and putting a lot of like high standards on kids who are young kids who are just supposed to be kids and supposed to make mistakes and leave their clothes on the floor or not make their bed or leave messes in the family room. Like, I remember how frustrated I would become and how critical I would become towards my kids when they weren't living up to my quote unquote standard, when they were, not always having a good day. And I just look at that season of my life where I was bringing all this perfectionism to myself, number one, and that's usually where it starts, a lot of perfectionism towards ourselves. And then it just spills out onto everything else. And unfortunately, it spilled out onto my kids. Now I have made many amends, and we talk about that pretty openly about my tendency to have kind of high standards, but they I think about that and how it plays out in my parenting, and did play out in my parenting. I have a lot of regrets about that. Working through them, and certainly making amends, but it was true. Perfectionism makes everything less perfect. And it certainly made my parenting with my children certainly less perfect. The other thing that perfectionism does is that perfectionism magnifies mistakes and minimizes progress. If you're a perfectionist, you're certainly going to be very focused on all the things that you're doing wrong or that other people are doing wrong. It puts this big magnifying glass on mistakes and failures and shortcomings, and it tends to be just the priority, the main focus of your life. And then the things that are good, the things that where we're making progress or having some wins, we tend to minimize that. We'll just kind of make that small and not nearly as significant as the mistakes. And so you get into this really self-judgment place, both for yourself and for others. And we put a ton of weight on mistakes, and we forget about all the progress that we're making. Right? Another thing to think about is that perfectionism will always make all the problems personal. One of the things that in the book, especially with a Q6, the question, am I good enough, is the tendency to personalize all problems for that question. Whenever anything goes wrong, Q6, am I good enough, will always believe that they're the reason why something is going wrong. We always think if there's a problem, the problem must be us. And unfortunately, perfection does not allow other factors into the conversation. So it always is making all problems personal. And that's tough. That's tough to live that way. I mean, it's just, you're constantly beating yourself up. You're constantly judging yourself. You constantly feel like you're not measuring up. And some of the stuff that's going on in your life and around you may have nothing to do with you, but you think it does because of perfectionism. Perfectionism is also is often like fear masked as nobility. And what I mean by that is sometimes we love to be sort of humble braggy, but perfectionism is not a badge of honor, but actually a sign of insecurity. And if you are kind of show up in this way that you feel like you're better than other people, and you have to sort of operate that way or communicate that way or be in a relationship where you're superior to other people, I guarantee you are struggling with perfectionism. You're also probably struggling with shame, which is a big driver of perfectionism. And so we got to kind of notice that it's those people who go like, I'd have to say my biggest weakness is I'm kind of a perfectionist. That, that's not something that you actually, it's not something you want to be proud of. Perfectionism is not something, is not a noble, mission. It's really something that is expressing a lot of pain and a lot of hurt in our lives. And so we need to be aware of that and be more honest with that. Perfectionism is often pain relief that keeps you in pain. Perfectionism isn't really about being perfect, but feeling perfect. And it puts you on this hamster wheel of high performance so you can feel like you're good. You can feel like you're valuable. You can feel like you're worthy of love. But you don't have to do any of that. You don't have to stay on this hamster wheel, because All of those things are already true of you, even if we stripped perfectionism and sort of flawless execution or always getting things right. We pulled all of that away. All those things are still true of you. You are worthy. You are loved. You are liked. You do have friends, even without the perfectionism. And so oftentimes it's like we try to be perfect so we don't feel less than, and we're trying to deal with that deep wound within us, that pain, that hurt, and we think we have to be something that we're not. Perfectionists often will create for the critic instead of the community. My friend John Acuff says this. He says, perfectionism is just misplaced creativity. Perfectionism is creativity applied to fear instead of hope. If you're a perfectionist, you might relate with this. You love to tinker on things to death. It's like maybe you're trying to write a book right now, or maybe you're in this project, or you're writing a song, or you're trying to create something. And a perfectionist will struggle big time to get that thing out there, to have it go to market, or have friends read the book or hear the song, or whatever you're creating. The perfectionist will always tinker on it and try to get it even more perfect. And unfortunately, perfectionism just stops dreams. It stops creativity. It stops the contribution. One of the stories that I love about Apple, I'm a big Apple fan. I have all kinds of Apple products. I have the iPhone. And the first iPhone was, absolutely revolutionary. But the very first generation of the iPhone, it shipped. The phone shipped without a copy and paste function or a handful of other features that Steve Jobs wanted to include. And I don't know if there's anybody who's more like, if there's a museum of perfectionists, I think Steve Jobs might have his portrait hanging in that museum. And yet Steve Jobs knew that it can't be perfect. It's not supposed to be perfect, because if I waited for all the functions that I want in the phone, if I have all the features, if I have the copy and paste function working, the phone never would have shipped. And so Steve Jobs, even the biggest perfectionist I know, okay, every detail had to be right. Even he understood that he could not apply his own personal perfectionism to the iPhone, because if he would have done that, it never would have shipped. Okay. And so I want you to think about, is there something that you have just been putting these very, very high standards on, these perfectionistic tendencies that you bring to your life, you're now bringing to your art, or to your projects or your ideas, and you feel like, oh my gosh, it has to be right. And if it's not perfect, I can't show anybody. If it's not perfect, I want to do like the 300th edit on my book before I show it to anybody. At some point, friends, we just got to say, like, we got to ship it. We got to get it out there. But perfectionism keeps you trapped in sort of this creative hamster wheel. And unfortunately, nobody gets to contribute it, be a part of your gifts and your contributions. So in closing, I want to talk about just kind of 2 simple phrases that I believe will help every perfectionist out there. Every person who struggles with this at some level. I want to give you 2 strong phrases to start adding to your vocabulary. Okay. And here they are. The phrase good enough and the phrase I did my best. If you could start adopting those phrases more into your life, instead of like, that's not good enough, or it's got to be better, or I could have done better. If you can, excuse me, if you can be much more living in that good enough and I did my best life versus the perfectionistic life, you're going to have so much more enjoyment. You're going to be so much more productive. You're going to be so less stressed. So good enough, like that's good enough. The book's good enough. The attempt was good enough. I did my best. Everything I brought to the table, it was what I could bring in that moment, in that season, in that meeting. I did my best. May have fell short, but that's okay. And then remember, it all boils down to the simple idea that we need to think progress, not perfection. See, if you put the filter of perfection on your life for everything, you will not make progress. You'll be stuck. You'll be just grinding along in life and you'll hate it. But if you can reframe your mindset around progress, see how far you're coming, see your growth, reflect a bit more. So, you know what? I'm doing better in this area. You know what? I am making progress in my relationships. I am making progress in my health or my fitness. I am making progress, with at work, wherever you're wanting to judge yourself. Identify progress. Document progress. Focus on the fact that you're making progress and that it's not about perfection. And then finally, the last thought for you, another kind of big concept to get into your Rolodex of phrases is that done is better than perfect. Done is better than perfect. Friends, we're waiting. We're waiting for you to spring your full self, your authentic self, your gifts, your projects, your ideas, whatever you want to put into the world. Like just bring it. We want it. We need it. And we can't wait any longer. You know, the perfectionistic tendencies of all of us are real. They're very powerful. They got started early on in our life, but they hold us back from who we were meant to be. They hold us back from healthier relationships. It holds us back from really having fun, making things and doing things and trying things. And so I encourage you, think progress, not perfection. Add those two phrases, good enough and I did my best, and you will start breaking the chains of perfectionism. Thanks so much for tuning in to today's episode of the Primal Question podcast. I hope you've learned something new about your primal question, or maybe the primal question of someone you know. If you think this episode would be helpful to a friend, I encourage you, please share it. Let people know about the podcast and how it's impacted you by sending a link to a friend. If you're ready to take the next step in your own self-discovery journey, I invite you to visit primalquestion.com/podcast. That's primalquestion.com/podcast for additional free resources and to explore the opportunity to work one-on-one with a Primal Question coach. Also, for those of you who feel a calling to guide others on their journey, there's information available about how you can become a certified Primal Question coach yourself. It's a powerful way to transform lives, including your own.